The Middle East was a battlefield for most of the 20th century. But one of the hardest fought wars of all was in 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. For 3 weeks, the battle swung violently from side to side. It brought each within sight of victory and defeat. And it brought the superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, close to a nuclear showdown.
The Israelis were in no doubt they were fighting for their country's very survival. For the soldiers of Syria and Egypt, it was a battle for Arab territory and Arab pride. The Egyptians put into effect a complicated deception plan to try and lull Israeli military intelligence into complacency. They had been gradually mobilizing their reserves, but at the beginning of October, they demobilized 20,000 men and sent them home. From what the Israelis could see, it didn't look like the Egyptian army was gearing up for war. As for the Egyptian soldiers based beside the canal, they were told to act as if nothing much was up. They could go swimming and bask in the sun in full view of the Israeli troops in the forts of the Bar-Lev line. Any military activity the Israeli lookouts did spot appeared to be just another regular exercise. By day, they watched as Egyptian troops came close to the canal to carry out maneuvers. At night, they appeared to head back inland to their barracks many miles away. Hundreds of miles to the north, the Syrians on the Golan appeared to be doing the same. But in fact, these troops weren't withdrawing every evening. Under cover of darkness, more and more Arab soldiers were massing on both fronts.
We started to train with real ammunition. We were also told we were going to Suez. We started to take our tanks, our amphibious unit on the railroad at night only, so the civilians couldn't see.
Reports of all this Egyptian activity were given to the heads of Israel's military intelligence. There'd been a number of false alarms in the past, and they were convinced that this was just another one. But they were wrong. At 4:30 a.m. on the 6th of October, the day of Yom Kippur, the phone rang at the home of Israel's military chief, General David Elazar. Elazar had been made Israeli chief of staff after a long military career and a host of victories. The call from Israeli military intelligence informed him that both Egypt and Syria would launch an attack in hours. Elazar's immediate thought was to send his air force to hit the Arabs before they had a chance to strike. But that decision could only be taken in the halls of power by Israel's politicians. And ultimately, that meant one person, Israel's Prime Minister, Golda Meir. This 75-year-old was seen as the Iron Lady of Israeli politics, but she said no to airstrikes. She argued that if Israel was to win international support after the Six-Day War, it had to be seen not as the aggressor, but the victim. Elazar was appalled at his leader's reaction. He was only given permission to mobilize a fraction of the reservists he needed, and yet, within a few hours, his country would face invasion on two fronts. Egypt and Syria were poised to launch their attack.
Just before 2 o'clock, the Egyptians put their part of the plan into action. Their assault across the canal on the forts of the Bar-Lev line was such a momentous event in Egyptian history, it was later restaged for the cameras. Thousands of Egypt's best-trained commandos crossed the Suez Canal in rubber dinghies. They landed on the east bank in the gaps between the forts of the Bar-Lev line. The Egyptian commandos then scrambled up the high sand ramparts. They attached rope ladders to make it easier for the soldiers following on behind them. Behind this first wave were 100,000 Egyptian infantry and more than 1,000 tanks waiting to cross the canal, but the biggest obstacle to them were the giant sand ramparts on the Israeli side. These were as much as 60 feet in height. It was impossible for the Egyptian tanks and heavy artillery to climb up and over them. The Egyptians experimented with using dynamite to blow holes in them, but this was found to take far too long. But then one junior engineer officer had a flash of genius. He suggested using high-pressure hoses to blast the ramparts with water from the canal. It was an extraordinary idea which would have to work if the entire Egyptian assault was to be a success. 4 hours into the attack, and with fighting raging around them, the Egyptian engineers finally broke through the ramparts, and the first tanks started to pour through.
I never believed I would see the day when I was in Sinai. But this was actually Sinai. I looked back at the West Bank and all the green on the other side, and to the east, all I could see is desert. It was good feeling.
The Israeli tanks raced towards the canal. They thought they'd throw the Egyptians back as easily as they had done in 1967. But as they got closer, they found themselves coming under attack from a weapon they'd never faced before. The Saga missile. This Soviet-made weapon was specifically designed to punch through the thick metal armor of tanks. Yet it was small enough to be carried onto the battlefield in a backpack. Unlike bigger anti-tank guns, the Saga could be set up in moments. This lightweight piece of kit was made all the more lethal because the missile could be steered onto its target. In 1973, the Saga was turning the Sinai into a tank graveyard. The tanks, which were the pride of Israel's army, were being destroyed by Egyptian infantrymen. Israel had begun the war with around 300 tanks in Sinai. By the end of the first 36 hours, they'd lost approximately half of this number. Things were critical for the Israeli soldiers in Sinai. For Israeli soldiers in bunkers along the front line of the Golan Heights, the first day of the war had been a disaster. Their strong defensive positions had done little to halt the Syrian advance. This is one of the Israeli bunkers dug in to the Golan Heights, and it's got an incredibly strong construction. It's deep underground, it's reinforced concrete, and these steel plates here as well. The amazing thing about 1973 is these strong points were so difficult for the Syrians to take, they didn't even bother trying. They simply bypassed them with their tanks and kept pushing forward. By the end of the day, the Syrians had taken almost the entire southern half of the Golan Heights.
It was a nightmare situation for Israel. It had been caught unawares with far too few troops on both front lines. All Elazar, the Israeli chief of staff, could do was to mobilize every single reservist in the country.
In towns, villages and farms across Israel, news filtered out that their country was under attack. Because it was a holiday, TV and radio was off the air, and so soldiers on motorbikes had to race through built-up areas, calling up the reservists.
I was in my kibbutz on Yom Kippur when I heard the planes taking off from the Air Force base in the area. I drove with another member of my kibbutz, who was also a company commander, to our assembly point. On the way, we said that whatever was happening, we'll probably be back home in a day or two.
Men and tanks headed out towards both fronts, but it would take 2 long days before they'd be ready to mount a counterattack. Then, on October the 8th, David Elazar announced to the world that his army had finally gone on the attack.
This morning, we started our counterattack, and we shall break and destroy completely all the attacking forces.
Elazar's first push was in the Sinai Desert.
The Egyptians had known that the Israelis would always counterattack, and they'd been lying in wait for just this moment. As soon as the Israeli tanks came into view, they let rip with devastating rocket, artillery and Saga missile fire.
The Israelis suffered heavy casualties all day. At least 50 of their tanks were destroyed or disabled. To the Israelis, it was abundantly clear this was no longer the poorly trained Egyptian army they'd fought in the past. By the end of the day, Israel was facing catastrophe. The Israelis had believed that once their army was in place, they would be victorious. Now they had to face the shocking truth that this hadn't happened. The Israelis, who saw both their fronts shattered by surprise attacks, made an astonishing military comeback. But the Arabs gave Israel a real shock.
For many Israelis, the 9,500 soldiers killed or wounded during the October War was an unacceptably high price to pay. They blamed their government for failing to heed the warnings that war was imminent. Israeli confidence was shattered. They were no longer the invincible military power that they had thought they were.
Despite the fact they'd suffered up to 30,000 casualties, perhaps in the end, the side that gained the most from this war was Egypt. The Egyptian crossing of the canal was seen as a major military achievement that restored Arab pride and gave President Sadat the confidence to make a spectacular bid for peace. In November 1977, the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, arrived in Israel, and in the Israeli parliament in Jerusalem itself, he became the first Arab leader to recognize the state of Israel.
ولقد جئت إليكم اليوم على قدمين ثابتتين.
Israel and Egypt were now on the road to peace, which culminated in 1982 with what Sadat had always wanted: a complete Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. But Sadat never saw it happen. On October the 6th, 1981, the 8th anniversary of the war, Anwar Sadat was assassinated by gunmen opposed to his peace treaty with Israel. The October War had claimed its last victim.
The war didn't sort out the fundamental disputes between the Israelis and the Arabs. In fact, technically, Israel is still in a state of war with Syria. All the treaties and all the talking still haven't brought peace to this part of the Middle East. And this barrier is a powerful reminder that the conflict with the Palestinians over who owns the land remains unresolved to this day.